Ashley Nicole Melnichek was born on July 21, 1987. Her sister described her as a very spunky person who was a bit of a daredevil and troublemaker. In 2015, 27-year-old Ashley was a mother to one daughter and living in an apartment in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Unfortunately, she began living a high-risk lifestyle by escorting for money. On June 3, 2015, at around 3:45 a.m., the Colorado Springs Police Department received a distressing call from Ashley's close friend, Bob Brando, saying he thought Ashley was dead. When police arrived at Ashley's apartment, they found her lying on her bedroom floor with a plastic bag and packing tape wrapped around her head and neck. She had sadly been stabbed to death, and the knife, along with a receipt from Home Goods, was found nearby. It was later determined that she had likely been dead for about 24 hours before being found. Missing was her white vehicle. Strangely, Bob had left the scene before the police arrived, putting him at the top of the suspect list. He would show back up and explain that he left because he was scared and nervous after finding her body. He was then taken to the station for questioning. He said that he and Ashley were extremely close friends and that he had come by to check on her on June 2nd after she had failed to answer his calls. However, when he arrived and knocked, a person who identified himself as JP came to the door and said Ashley was at home. So he returned to his car and tried calling Ashley a few more times. He then waited in his car until he saw JP leave. He returned the next day on June 3rd and forced his way into her apartment and discovered her body. He was then asked about her former boyfriends and told them about a soldier by the name of Tyler who was stationed at Fort Carson. However, when they tried to contact Fort Carson, they were unable to find anyone named Tyler. Even though they were skeptical of Bob's story, he was free to go but remained a person of interest. Investigators then learned that Ashley had been married to a guy named Jason, with whom she had a daughter with, and after their divorce, he got full custody of the child. However, he was ruled out as a suspect. Investigators then turned to the Home Goods receipt and obtained the surveillance footage from the store. In it, they saw Ashley with an unknown man who later identified himself as Justin Braun after seeing a news report about Ashley's murder. He told investigators he had helped Ashley move in on May 21st and had gone to Home Goods with her. Just like Jason, he was ruled out as a suspect. Police then got a call that Ashley's missing white vehicle had been found and was being driven by a couple of petty criminals named Tom and Stephanie. After being arrested, they claimed the car was given to them by a stranger. Investigators were immediately skeptical until they said the name of the man who gave them the car. That man's name was JP, the same name given to them by Bob. Investigators were able to track down JP and learned that his full name was Jonathan Paul Nelson, and he had been dishonorably discharged from the Marines 2 years earlier after allegedly assaulting a woman with a sledgehammer. They showed a photo of Jonathan to the couple driving the car and to Ashley's friend, and all three identified him as JP. The police were shocked when a neighbor from the apartment complex called and reported that JP had shown back up carrying a duffel bag. When officers arrived, they spotted him running through an alley. He then jumped in his car and a police chase ensued, which ended after JP crashed. When they looked inside the duffel bag, they found a tarp, a machete, carpet cleaner, brushes, and utility gloves. When questioned about Ashley's murder, JP claimed he hadn't heard from Ashley and went to check on her. He also denied being at her apartment on June 1st. After that, he lawyered up and was subsequently arrested and charged with her murder. On June 30th, 2015, investigators received a call from an inmate saying that JP had confessed to stabbing Ashley. He also said that JP didn't act alone and another man named Ponyboy was also involved. Around the same time, they found the ex that Bob was talking about. His name was Joseph Tyler Kempsey, and he went by his middle name. Turned out Bob was right. She had been dating a man by the name of Tyler, who was stationed at Fort Carson. But according to the Army, he was AWOL. When he was brought in for questioning, they asked him if he knew who Ponyboy was, and he responded, "That's me." Investigators then discovered that Ashley had filed several domestic violence reports against him. He was then arrested on June 30th for 7 warrants involving fraud, vehicle theft, drugs, and multiple traffic violations. Just like JP, Tyler denied being involved in Ashley's murder, and claimed he was driving to South Carolina around the time of the murder. It was discovered that JP and Tyler met in jail and came up with the idea to rob Ashley of the cash she kept in her apartment. She allegedly kept around $20,000 she made from escorting because her friends said she didn't trust banks. They also discovered a recorded phone call made from JP, who was released on bond in May, to Tyler, who was still in jail. During that phone call, JP says, "I will make sure I effing get her." At some point, JP texted her, asking if she wanted to hang out, but she said no. Tyler then had a female friend bail him out of jail. Once out, he also began texting Ashley and they agreed to meet at her apartment. When he arrived, he had JP with him. Ashley let both men inside her apartment where they began demanding she open her safe and give them money, but she refused, so they murdered her. Ashley fought back so hard that it took both pieces of shit to hold her down. At trial, Tyler put all the blame on JP and claimed he had never even been to her new apartment. However, DNA would prove otherwise. They also found cell phone records proving he wasn't in South Carolina, as he originally said. Instead, both men's cell phones pinged near Ashley's apartment. They also found a receipt on him from a local fishing shop called Angler's Covey Fly Shop. Not to mention multiple witnesses saw him in Colorado Springs on the day of the murder. They also found JP's bloody fingerprint on the plastic bag. During the trial, they showed that Tyler held a grudge against Ashley for being an escort and having their child aborted. In the end, both were convicted of first-degree murder and robbery and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shanti Cooper met David Tronis, who went by Dave, on Match.com in 2013. At the time, both were going through a divorce and Shanti had a young son. Dave had told Shanti he was a millionaire who had inherited between $4 and $6 million from his father. He then moved from Minnesota to Orlando, Florida in April 2015 to be closer to her. He paid $600,000 in cash for a house on East Copeland Drive and put it in a trust in his mother's name. The home was a 4,000 square feet, older-style Victorian home with a pool and a garage apartment. The two continued their relationship and eventually married in 2017. However, after the marriage, Shanti's life turned into a nightmare. They had decided to renovate their home, but Dave became obsessed with it. He ended up having every single interior dividing wall removed from the home, leaving a two-story shell. It was clear he had no idea what he was doing. At that point, the house was a money pit and unlivable, forcing the couple to move into the garage apartment. While he oversaw the renovations, Shanti ran a successful financial software business in her upstairs office. Plus, she was having to pay all the bills, including renovation costs and buying groceries. Her family found this strange since Dave was supposed to be a millionaire. It also wasn't helped by the fact that her name wasn't even on the deed to the house. In March of 2018, Dave reached out to his neighbor Keith Ory, who renovated homes for a living and had appeared on the A&E show Zombie House Flipping. Keith agreed to look at the house and was shocked that the entire interior had been gutted. However, he agreed to take on the renovation as long as the couple agreed to be filmed for the show. When Keith came back in mid-April to ensure that they were both on board, they both agreed, but right afterward, a clearly upset Shanti left. It was clear she didn't really want to do the show and was being pressured by Dave. Unfortunately, their marriage had hit an all-time low, with their arguments only getting worse, and now they were living in separate areas of the house. Shanti had moved her and her son into the studio apartment on the property, and Dave began sleeping on a couch in the garage. It was at this point that Shanti decided she was done, but Dave had other plans. On April 24, 2018, Shanti was found murdered in the home. Dave claimed that he found her bloody body in the bathtub after spending the day cleaning and walking the dogs. He told investigators he believed she had slipped and fallen in the bathtub. He said after finding her, he pulled her from the tub, carried her into the bedroom, and placed her on a mattress pad. Strangely, when emergency responders arrived, they found both of them dry. It was later determined that Shanti had been beaten and strangled to death. Dave was immediately a suspect and all his lies were about to come out. Not only was he not a millionaire, but there was never any inheritance. He had also been stepping outside the marriage by visiting bathhouses to have sex with random men. As investigators searched the home, they found blood on Shanti's bed. When Dave was confronted with this evidence, he said that someone must have broken into the house and murdered Shanti while he was out. Plus, her engagement ring was missing. Investigators spent 8 hours trying to get a confession from Dave, but he maintained his innocence. For months later, in August 2018, Dave was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. When he was arrested, they found Shanti's missing engagement ring. Investigators believe that Dave murdered her in the bedroom and then moved her body to the bathtub. Before moving it back to the bedroom, they believe he murdered her because she was about to find out the truth about his affairs and lack of money. Dave was diagnosed with schizophrenia but still found mentally competent to stand trial. In the end, 55-year-old Dave was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Mary Jane Croft was born in West Virginia on November 19, 1911, and quit school after completing the 8th grade. When she was 17, she married James Leslie Van Gelder on January 29, 1929. During the marriage, Mary Jane was a stay-at-home mom to her 5 children. They separated in 1943 and the children remained with James. She then moved into an apartment in Fairmont, West Virginia, and began working different jobs, including waitressing and clerical work. It's alleged that once she was back on her feet, she asked James to bring the children and move in with her, but he declined. At some point in late 1943 or early 1944, Mary Jane moved to Ohio. After moving, she maintained contact with her children through her oldest daughter, Anna, by mailing war bonds, letters, and clothes to them. On March 7, 1944, she got a job as a storekeeper at the Air Force Depot in Shelby, Ohio. By the end of May, she had been promoted to junior warehouseman. In February of the following year, she requested a transfer and reassignment to the high lift fork operator position. That same year, she sent a letter to her children asking them to return the war bonds. A few weeks later, she strangely returned one of them. That was the last time her family ever heard from her again. For almost 80 years, her disappearance would remain a mystery. As time went on, her children and eventually her grandchildren continued searching for her. They sent DNA samples to various genealogy websites, but no results were ever returned. In October of 2018, Detective Adam Turner received a message from one of Mary Jane's granddaughters, Mindy Wilson. She was looking for information on her missing grandmother. When Turner began looking into the case, he found it was missing Mary's fingerprints and DNA and only had 2 photographs. He also found that her disappearance back in 1945 was barely looked into. As he continued his investigation, he discovered that her official date of disappearance was on March 8th, when she requested an immediate release from her job due to added household duties. Her final address she gave was a post office box in Willard, Ohio. That date is probably inaccurate because a former associate of hers reported seeing her a few weeks later. Mary Jane had filed for divorce on February 14, 1945, and in the divorce filing, she accused James of extreme cruelty and gross neglect of duty. James and Mary's children dispute this and say their father was not abusive at all. It's likely the attorney put this in there because it was more difficult to get a divorce at the time and they needed a good reason even if it was untrue. On November 23, 1945, back in West Virginia, James also filed for divorce. However, Mary Jane never responded to the petition either in person or through her attorney. On November 26th, the West Virginia divorce was granted with James getting full custody of the 5 children. On April 4, 1946, the divorce petition Mary Jane had filed in Ohio was dismissed because she failed to show up for court. The court costs were deducted from a sum of money she'd previously deposited with the court. James died in 1985, and the house he'd shared with Mary Jane burned down not long afterward. In 2005, a newspaper in Plymouth published a story about Mary's disappearance and asked anyone who remembered her to contact her family. A man who had been 13 years old in 1945 saw the article and wrote to Mary's children. The man said that his father and two older brothers had worked at the Air Force Depot at the same time as Mary Jane, and that she was friends with his parents. According to the man, Mary Jane couldn't drive, and between 1944 and 1945, she often got rides to work with his father and brothers. However, he couldn't provide any information about her disappearance. Detective Turner began going through Jane Does that were found starting in 1945. Multiple remains were tested, but none turned out to be Mary. At a loss on where to go next, he decided to release her military file online. A sleuther came forward and provided information on a man named Percy Sebrin. Turns out when Mary Jane was promoted to the high lift fork operator position, she took that position from Percy. Turner then found information about Percy on findagrave.com and learned he died in Kansas City, Missouri in 1969. It also showed that he was married to Mary Jane J. Sebrin, who was born on November 19, 1911 and died in 1990. Both were buried in Forest, Louisiana. The reason Mary Jane filed for divorce in February 1945 and quit her job a month later was that she and Percy were getting married. She quit her job so he could take it over. They eventually married and had 2 children together. Mary's death was from colon cancer at the age of 78. Mary's grandchildren from her marriage with Percy described her as the perfect grandmother. They said she loved to garden and her favorite flower was the hydrangea. They also said she loved sun tea and was a great cook. I have no clue why this was in a newspaper, but on August 12, 1965, they reported that Mr. and Mrs. John Cheney had Mr. and Mrs. Percy Sebrin of Pine Bluff over to their house. It's sad that she chose to cut all communication with her Van Gilder children, and we may never know the reason why. Byron Howard Carr was born on June 1, 1952. In 1988, 36-year-old Byron, a former English teacher at Montague Regional High School, was living on Lafhorn Avenue in Charlottetown on Prince Edward Island. He was a gay man, but since it wasn't widely accepted at the time, he kept it a secret. On November 11, 1988, his body was discovered in his home. He had been strangled with a towel and stabbed to death. Found on the wall was a very eerie message that read, "I will kill again." Investigators believe that Byron knew his killer and had brought him home to have consensual sex. Thankfully, they were able to collect male DNA from underwear found at the scene, but the case would still go unsolved for the next 35 years. In 2007, the case was reopened and DNA samples were gathered from suspects, but none were a match. In 2022, the male DNA was sent off for forensic genetic genealogy, and a potential suspect by the name of Todd Joseph Gallant was found. Through investigative work, they were able to prove his DNA matched the DNA found on the underwear at the crime scene. On January 25, 2024, Todd was arrested at his home in Soares on Prince Edward Island and charged with first-degree murder and interfering with human remains. Strangely, a second person was also arrested but was later released. That individual's name hasn't been released, but they are still investigating them. Hopefully, they release some more information about this second individual. Todd, who was 21 years old at the time of the murder, has a criminal record that spanned multiple places, including Canada, Texas, and Arkansas. In 1987, he was convicted for breaking and entering on Prince Edward Island. This was a year before Byron's murder. He then left the island sometime after 1988, living in Texas and Arkansas, before returning in 2022. He currently remains in custody awaiting trial. Rosalind Lynn Cruz was a native of Minneapolis, Minnesota, born on January 25, 1970. When she was around 4 years old, her family moved outside of Tampa to Gibsonton, Florida. In 1993, 23-year-old Rosalind was living in Tampa and working as a waitress. On November 1st, Rosalind was seen getting into a vehicle with an unknown man. She and the man then traveled to a friend's home on Mike Drive. After that, she was never seen alive again. Later that day, at about 10:40 p.m., her body was discovered on East Bay Road in Gibsonton. She had sadly been strangled to death. The man who picked her up was later identified as Michael Rizzo, and he lived just zero point 0.4 miles from where her body was discovered. This immediately put him at the top of the suspect list. While Michael claimed that he dropped her off alive and denied having anything to do with her murder, he agreed to a polygraph exam and failed. It looked like they had their guy, but when they interviewed his wife and girlfriend, they gave conflicting statements about the day, which police say complicated the investigation. Since they didn't have any physical evidence against Michael, he was released and never charged. In 2021, investigators obtained DNA from Michael's daughter to compare against DNA found on Rosalind's body. The DNA was a match, but Michael, unfortunately, could not be arrested because he died on March 2, 2011. On May 6, 1999, a fisherman found a body in Lake Barkley, located in Lyon County, Kentucky. The body was that of a man wrapped in heavy tire chains and anchored with a hydraulic jack. Whoever killed him wanted him to sink into the lake and never be found. He'd had gold crowns and a permanent bridge, worn extra-large t-shirt with a No Fear sports bar logo, a Dallas Cowboys windbreaker, and a 10.5 wide Voigt tennis shoes. Unfortunately, they were unable to identify him using traditional investigative techniques, and he would remain unknown for the next 24 years. In 2016, the body was exhumed for further testing, including DNA technology, dental examinations, and other forensic testing, but still no matches were found. In 2023, the state police enlisted the help of NamUs and Othram, and through their testing efforts, a potential relative of the man was discovered. From there, investigators were able to identify the remains as Roger Dale Parham, a fugitive on the run from the FBI. 52-year-old Roger had been on the run from Arkansas following a sexual assault charge against a minor in 1999. He was out on bond but failed to show up to court. It's believed he might have traveled to Mexico before ending up in the Kentucky lake. Investigators believe he was murdered, but that part of the case remains unsolved. Could a vigilante have murdered him after they found out why he was on the run? Kayla Campos was born to parents Carl and Gayla Campos. In 2019, 21-year-old Kayla was living in New Mexico and aspired to be a dental hygienist. Just before midnight on October 18, 2019, Kayla and her boyfriend, Sydney, were playing Pokemon Go at Bianchetti Park near her apartment in Albuquerque. This was a daily routine for them, but unfortunately, this night would be different and would end in tragedy. As they were driving, they came upon 3 teenagers being robbed at gunpoint by 2 men in the middle of Granite Avenue. In a panic, quickly turned her car around to leave when one of the suspects began chasing her car and opened fire with an assault rifle. One of the bullets struck Kayla in the head and caused her to crash into a nearby home. She was rushed to the University of New Mexico Hospital, where she was sadly pronounced dead. It turns out the shooter, 19-year-old Isaiah Garcia, believed that the car Kayla and her boyfriend were in was owned by a member of a rival gang named Christian Maddock. A few weeks before Garcia murdered Kayla, he murdered 17-year-old Sean Markey. Just like in Kayla's case, he said Sean was not the intended target. Sean was attending a homecoming party when things got out of control after some individuals showed up uninvited. Those individuals began pulling out their guns to show them off, at which point everyone was asked to leave. One of those individuals was Garcia, who allegedly came to the party to seek revenge on another teen. Once everyone was asked to leave, Sean and his friend were left to wait for their ride home. That's when Garcia opened fire and a bullet ricocheted and struck Sean. He was rushed to the hospital but sadly didn't survive. In August of 2021, Garcia was found guilty of Sean's murder and sentenced to life in prison. A few months earlier, in April of 2021, while he was in jail awaiting trial, he stabbed a fellow inmate multiple times. Garcia claimed the stabbing was revenge for the death of his half-brother. For that charge, he took a plea deal. As for Kayla's murder, Garcia was charged with 8 crimes that included first-degree murder, shooting at a motor vehicle, armed robbery, assault with intent to commit a violent felony, tampering with evidence, child abuse, and conspiracy in connection with Kayla's murder. On February 29, 2024, he was found guilty of all charges. He has yet to be sentenced but is facing another life term in prison. Justin McLean Bloxam was born on May 29, 1997 in Shreveport, Louisiana to Amy and Kevin. In 2010, 12-year-old Justin was an honors student at North DeSoto Middle School and was said to enjoy playing football for the Griffins football team, skateboarding, karate, and playing the drums. He was also good at science and won first place at a science fair. On top of that, he was a member of the 4-H club and enjoyed helping on his grandfather's farm. On March 30, 2010, Justin was staying at a friend's home in Stonewall, Louisiana when he began receiving texts from a person he assumed was a 14-year-old girl. During the texts, the girl was trying to convince him to sneak out of the house so the two could meet and have sex. She even offered to send over a taxi. After some convincing, Justin finally agreed. And at 3 a.m., he snuck out of the friend's home and climbed into the taxi. Unbeknownst to Justin, the girl was actually a sex offender by the name of Brian Douglas Horn, who was driving the taxi. After getting in the car, he was never seen alive again. It turns out that Horn's stepdaughter was a friend of Lauren Lindsay's, who was also friends with Justin. Horn had asked to borrow Lauren's phone to get ringtones off of it, but instead he was secretly getting Justin's phone number. When Justin's friend's family woke up later that morning and realized Justin was gone, they reported him missing. When law enforcement arrived, they began questioning neighbors and learned that a green action taxi cab was seen at the house. When a deputy with the department learned they were looking for a green taxi, he informed investigators that he saw one parked on the side of U.S. Highway 171 last night and stopped to investigate. The officer said that Horn told him that he had run out of gas and lost his key, and that someone from the taxi company was bringing him another one. Other witnesses had also seen him and stopped to ask if he needed help and were also told the same story. Investigators went and searched the woods in the area where Horn's taxi was last seen and sadly found Justin's body in a shallow pool of water about 30 to 40 yards from the highway. The key to the taxi was also found in the same area. It was most likely dropped during the assault and murder. As for Justin's cause of death, the medical examiner determined he had been ultimately smothered to death. When Horn's brother, Kevin, learned that his brother was a person of interest in Justin's murder, he followed him to the action taxi to return the car and then drove him to the police station. On April 12, 2010, Horn was indicted by a grand jury for first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. A jury then found him guilty and sentenced him to death. However, in September 2018, the sentence was vacated by the Louisiana Supreme Court because of a ruling in another capital murder case where the defendant's attorney conceded their guilt before the jurors. In 2023, a new trial took place and ended the same as the first, with him being found guilty and sentenced to death. In 1972, 59-year-old Nellie Ann Hicks was living in Newark, California and working as a fourth-grade teacher at Ashland School. She was a single mother to 6 children after leaving her abusive husband 10 years ago. Sadly, all that would be taken away from her on May 10, 1972, when someone broke into her house, sexually assaulted and beat her to death. Her 30-year-old son, Ronald, found her body in the living room the next morning. Before she was murdered, she spoke with her housemate, a fellow teacher, around 1 a.m. before heading off to bed. This was the last time she was seen alive. After the murder, the killer took her wallet and discarded it a few blocks away. Investigators determined that the killer had entered the home through an unlocked sliding glass door and then used manicure scissors to cut her clothes off. They were able to collect the killer's fingerprints, but they didn't match anyone in the database. Since nobody in the home, including Ron and his wife, heard the attack, they theorized that she had been knocked unconscious almost immediately using a brick. Unfortunately, with little to no leads, the case would go unsolved for the next 52 years. A few years later, Nellie's murder would be connected to the murder of 48-year-old Teresa Pica. On May 15, 1979, Teresa was found sexually assaulted and murdered 20 minutes from Newark in Hayward, California. Just like Nellie, she was beaten to death. The next morning, one of her 10-year-old twin daughters found her body. Instead of a brick, the attacker used a rock to kill her after entering the home through a front room window that he pried open. Once again, the killer took the victim's wallet and discarded it in a neighbor's yard. Even though they determined the cases were connected, they were still unable to find the killer. In 2021, the Hayward Police Department sent items from evidence to Otheram for DNA testing. Using genetic genealogy and follow-up investigative work, the killer was identified as a 73-year-old convicted sex offender Fred Farnham. Unfortunately, he died in 2007 in Oregon. Farnham had spent time in prison in the 70s for several sexual assaults in Sunnyvale and San Jose. He could be connected to other cases since he moved around quite a bit, living in Nevada, Idaho, North Dakota, Alaska, and Oregon. Unfortunately, Nellie's son, Ronald, who discovered her body, passed away 3 months before the police solved the case. Sonia Carmen Herrick Stone was born in Quebec, Canada on May 27, 1951. When Sonia was a teenager, she met and fell in love with David Foreman. In 1972, David left Canada for California and Sonia soon followed. Once in California, she wanted to get married and have kids, but David wasn't ready. So they ended the relationship but remained close friends. She then met Michael Stone and the two quickly fell in love and married. Sonia then gave birth to a daughter named Sasha and David became the child's godfather. Unfortunately, after the child's birth, Michael lost his high-paying job and Sonia was suffering from postpartum depression. This began to cause tension in the marriage and they eventually separated. By 1981, 30-year-old Sonia was a single mother living in Carmel by the sea with 4-year-old Sasha and working at Levi Strauss. Around this time, she began receiving phone calls from someone who would hang up after she answered. She also felt like she was being watched. On September 15, 1981, while her closest friend, Caroline McBride, was over at her home, they began hearing loud footsteps and someone in the bushes. They called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. A month later, on October 15, 1981, Sonia gets up and sends her daughter off to preschool. Her friend, Caroline, does the same and decides to drop by her house. When she arrived, she saw Sonia's car in the driveway and went up and knocked on the door. But strangely, no one answered. She tried the door and it was unlocked. So she proceeded inside only to have the shock of her life. Sonia was dead on the floor. Worried that the killer was still in the house, she fled the scene and had a neighbor call the police. When investigators arrived, they found Sonia had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Investigators noticed that her left ring fingernail was broken and had blood underneath it, which indicated to them that she had scratched her killer. They asked Caroline who she thought might have murdered Sonia and she pointed at Sonia's husband, Michael Stone. He immediately became the #1 suspect, especially since he wasn't being overly cooperative. This was most likely due to the fact that he was very unhappy about the accusations being thrown at him. Since there was no physical evidence tying him to the murder and he had a very solid alibi, he was removed from the suspect list. However, Sonia's family and friends still felt he was responsible. After moving on from Michael, the detective on the case decided to canvass the neighborhood looking for witnesses and stumbled upon 25-year-old Michael Scott Glazebrook, who lived across the street. When the detective approached him and began asking him questions, he found it strange that Glazebrook was wearing a mask. So the investigator asked him to take it off and to his surprise, Glazebrook had a 3 to 4 inch vertical scratch down his right cheek. Glazebrook explained that he was wearing the mask because he was sanding fiberglass on his boat when the detective approached him. He also explained that the gash on his face was from plexiglass that splintered while he was cutting it. However, when investigators looked at the plexiglass and the work table in the garage, they found no blood at all. They wanted to bring him in for an official interview, but they didn't want to spook him, so they went back to the office and ran a warrant check, and discovered he had 2 traffic warrants. So they arrested him for those and brought him in and began questioning him about Sonia's murder. At that point, he gave investigators a different story. This time, he said that he was in her house on the day of the murder because he and Sonia were having an affair. They also noticed that during the interview, he was really nervous and wasn't giving straight answers. So they asked him to take a polygraph exam and he agreed but failed the test. Unfortunately, all they had at the time was a blood type test. And while the blood found under her fingernail matched Glazebrook's blood type, it wasn't hardcore proof that he committed the crime. His girlfriend then came forward and said that he told her he was in Sonia's house on the morning of the murder. In July of 1982, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Unfortunately, since he was brought in on traffic warrants, but questioned about Sonia's murder, the judge would not allow the interrogation to be presented to the jury. During the trial, which started in November of 1983, Glazebrook's parents took the stand and testified under oath that their son had no scratches on his face on the day of the murder, even though they had photos of him with the scratch at the police station. However, jurors never got to see the photo of him with the scratch because the camera they used to take the photo failed and a photograph was never produced. Then his girlfriend got on the stand and recanted her statement, claiming that detectives force-fed her the information about him being in the house that morning. The trial ended with a hung jury with only 3 out of the 12 jurors believing he was guilty. After the mistrial, the district attorney decided not to retry him. For the next 41 years, her family would believe that Sonia's husband, Michael Stone, was responsible, but it was impossible with his alibi. When Sonia's daughter, Sasha, was older, she began asking detectives why her mother's case was not reopened if they were so sure Glazebrook had committed the murder. Finally, in June of 2020, 13 years after Sasha began asking them to reopen the case, all the evidence was re-examined. From there, they decided to send some of the items off for DNA testing. The only problem was that the blood vial from Glazebrook had broken while sitting in evidence, so they had to obtain a new sample. Glazebrook was now in his 60s, divorced with an 11-year-old child and living not far from the crime scene at his parents' home. He was also a coach and umpire for Little League Baseball and drove a school bus. Thankfully, detectives were able to obtain a search warrant for his DNA and pulled him over. While he was pulled over, they asked if he even knew Sonia, and he surprisingly said no, which was completely different from his story all those years ago when he said the two were having an affair. When the DNA results came back, they weren't surprised to find that it matched Glazebrook. He was then arrested in August of 2021 and once again charged with her murder. In honor of Sonia, all the detectives wore Levi's jeans for the arrest. The new trial would go much smoother because of the DNA evidence, and on February 6, 2023, 41 years after Sonia's murder, Glazebrook was convicted of first-degree murder. After the trial, Sonia's brother apologized to Michael Stone for the years of accusations. Michael Scott Glazebrook was allowed to spend the last 41 years free because his parents and girlfriend lied under oath. I can only hope that there are no other victims, but as you know, most murderers don't just kill once. Warren Bruce Barnes was born on May 19, 1951 in Grand Junction, Colorado. He then spent the rest of his life in Grand Junction, but unfortunately, by the age of 69, he found himself homeless. Warren was well known around town and could generally be found sitting in a breezeway near the shop called Monique's Bridal, owned by Monique Lenati, where he would read the books that were donated to him by locals. He read so often he took on the nickname Reading Man. He was never one to beg and would generally only speak if spoken to. He was so well known around town that when he failed to show up on Monday, March 1, 2021 to the temp job agency people ready where he showed up every day, Monday through Friday asking about jobs, they noticed immediately. He also wasn't in the chair that Monique provided him, so she and Ali Talindi, who worked for Guild Mortgage, decided to track him down. After speaking with managers at People Ready, she called the police and reported him missing. Unbeknownst to the women, the police were already on the case, even if they didn't know it yet. On the night of February 28, 2021, police were called to a stuck vehicle in the water off a boat ramp on the Colorado River. When they arrived, they found 19-year-old Brian Cohey, who said he came and parked at the boat ramp because he needed to get out and wanted somewhere where he could relax and think. As the car was being pulled out of the water, they noticed a lot of red dripping down the back of the car. At first, they thought Cohey was injured, but he said he was fine. Since there was no evidence of a crime, no further investigation was done, at least not yet. The next morning, Cohey's father, Brian Sr., strangely found Warren's wallet in the vehicle. He looked through the wallet and found a card for the People Ready agency and notified them. They were baffled at why Warren's wallet would have been by a boat ramp on the Colorado River, as he typically never left the confines of the city. Brian Sr. also found a large knife and latex gloves in the glove box. However, it was his mother, Terry, who made the most horrifying discovery. As she was going through Cohy's closet, she found a Rubbermaid container with a plastic bag inside covered in maggots. She pulled it out and placed it in the kitchen sink, and to her horror, there was a head inside. In a panic, she called 911. When police arrived, Cohy approached them and confessed to the murder of Warren. He then went on to describe the events that led up to Warren's murder. He said that he was in a bad state of mind for the last few months because he had stopped taking his medication. This caused his thoughts of murder to worsen, and he began searching for his first victim, which took weeks to find. He had one criteria for his victim: someone who wouldn't be missed. So he began looking for a homeless person, and on the night of February 27th, 2021, he found Warren Barnes. That night, around 11:30 p.m., he came upon what looked to him like a homeless encampment under a bridge near the sheriff's department. He put on 3 gloves, pulled off the canvas that was covering Warren, and using the knife his father later found in the glove box, stabbed him to death. He said that Warren's final words were, and I quote, "Why are you attacking me?" He then went into details that are too gruesome for YouTube, but ended with remains in a container that his mother would later find. He then drew a map for authorities to find the rest of Warren's remains. He was so obsessed with murder that he compared himself to Ed Kemper and said he wore a blue jumpsuit on the night of the murder. He also described the blue jumpsuit as something Michael Myers wore from the movie Halloween, and said he even had the Michael Myers mask in his room. He said he threw some of the remains into the river, which is how his car got stuck off the boat ramp. Cohy was then arrested and charged on suspicion of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and tampering with a deceased body. He then pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Cohy's mother, Terry, said her son was diagnosed with autism, major depressive disorder, and ADHD. She said he always knew he was not like other people and even obtained the nickname Dahmer in middle school. Cohy told his parents that he began hearing whispers at night starting a year before the murder. He also said he felt like he was always being watched, even by the birds and the walls. However, the jury wasn't buying the insanity defense and found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Not once during the trial did Cohy show any remorse. Even as local community members got up to speak of Warren's life. To remember Warren, Tim Navin, a metal artist, spent 285 hours creating a memorial for him, which consists of a metal replica of the bamboo chair he would sit in along with a stack of books with the words, "You also," which is how he would respond to people that said for him to have a good day. Bianca Teresa Finicio was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on December 4, 1959. In 2016, 56-year-old Bianca and her husband, Dr. Lawrence Rudolph, who went by Larry, had been married for 34 years and had 2 children. He was a very wealthy dentist, and both of them were known for participating in big game hunting. Larry even served a few years as the president of Safari Club International. In October of 2016, the couple went on a hunting trip in Zambia, Africa. Bianca had always wanted to hunt a leopard and was excited to finally have the opportunity. The trip lasted about 10 days as they traveled around with their local game scout Spencer Kakoma. The couple spent the final day packing at their 2-room cabin in Kung Fui National Park when tragedy struck. Larry claims that while he was in the bathroom, he heard a gunshot and rushed out to find Bianca bleeding on the floor. He told authorities she must have accidentally shot herself while packing the 12-gauge shotgun. However, their game scout, Spencer, said that he was sure all the guns had been emptied of ammunition after the hunt. Before returning to the States, Larry quickly had her body cremated, which led a friend of hers to suspect Larry had more to do with his wife's death than he was leading on. So, she called the FBI and told them everything she knew. Part of that information was the fact that Larry had been having an affair with a woman named Lori Milliron for the past 15 to 20 years. During that time, he had been verbally abusive to Bianca. The friend also said that Bianca told her she and Larry were having arguments over money. The Zambian authorities, unfortunately, took Larry at his word and ruled her death an accident. However, law enforcement in the U.S. was not buying it and began investigating Bianca's death as a homicide. They spent the next 5 years gathering evidence. In the meanwhile, Larry and Lori married, and he began collecting on the 9 insurance policies he had on Bianca. In 2021, law enforcement determined that based on a reconstruction of the crime scene and the 6.5 to 8 feet the gun was fired from, it was not possible for Bianca to have pulled the trigger. In December of that year, Larry was arrested and charged with her murder. Prosecutors believe he murdered Bianca so he could collect the $4.9 million in life insurance money, and so he could continue his relationship with Lori. When Lori was brought in front of a grand jury, she lied about their relationship and the cash payment Larry had given her. 3 months after his arrest, Lori was arrested and charged with accessory to the murder, obstructing the investigation into the crime and committing perjury before a grand jury. That's when she finally came clean and told investigators that in 2020, while she and Larry were having dinner, he confessed to killing Bianca. In the end, Larry was convicted of foreign murder and mail fraud related to the insurance policy payouts. He was then sentenced to life in prison. He was also ordered to pay $4.8 million in restitution plus a fine of $2 million and forfeit all assets obtained after the murder. For Lori's crimes, she was sentenced to 17 years in prison for encouraging the murder, being an accessory to the murder, obstructing the investigation into the crime, and committing perjury before a grand jury. Breja DeMariatorel was born in Davenport, Iowa on December 4, 2009. In 2020, 10-year-old Breja was a student at Jackson Elementary School and was described as someone who could uplift anyone and bring a smile to their face. On the night of July 9, 2020, Breja was at her half-brother's house having a sleepover, and his father was, unfortunately, a 47-year-old registered sex offender by the name of Henry Earl Dinkins. The next morning, on July 10th, Breja was strangely nowhere to be found. At 8:08 a.m., he called her mother, Aisha Langford, and told her Breja was missing. Dinkins and Aisha had dated for about 2 years, and he had fathered one of her children. Dinkins was arrested in August 1990 when he was 17 years old and pleaded guilty to third-degree sexual abuse of a 5-year-old. Due to these past charges, he immediately became a suspect in her disappearance. When he was brought in for an interview, he was acting strange and claimed that he had left the apartment in the middle of the night, and when he returned, she was gone. The detective then asked if they could download all the data from his phone, and Dinkins began acting even stranger. Investigators were looking for Dinkins' 2007 Chevy Impala and asked him where it was. He first tells officers that friends are driving it and later says it's around. It was eventually discovered a block from the police station. When the car was searched, they found a strong bleach smell inside and an axe containing traces of what appeared to be blood. Meanwhile, law enforcement and her family continued to search for Breja. The search would last until March 22, 2021. When a group of fishermen in DeWitt, Iowa stumbled upon her decomposed remains in a pond. An autopsy determined that she had been shot to death. In July of 2021, Dinkins was arrested and charged with her murder after being picked up for violating the sexual offender registration laws. Prosecutors theorized that Dinkins took her to where she was ultimately found. Once there, he sexually assaulted and killed her. However, there was no physical evidence to back that up. What they did have, though, was Breja's half-brother's testimony. He said that he woke up in the middle of the night during the sleepover and noticed his father, Dinkins, and his sister were gone. He said that his father showed back up just before 6 a.m. and took him to a local Walmart where he bought 2 bottles of bleach. He then traveled to the location where Breja's body was later found. He also said he saw his father cleaning a machete with bleach and that machete was later found inside his RV. Video surveillance and cellular data also confirmed his movements that night. Plus, his Impala was recorded 5 times along the river where her body was found between 2 and 3 a.m. In the end, Dinkins was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. Fabio Cimentilli was born on July 13, 1967 in Toronto, Canada. Those who knew him well described him as a very charming and witty individual. In 2011, 44-year-old Fabio was working for the hair product company Wella and was recently promoted to an executive position. He then moved to Los Angeles, California with his wife Monica and their two daughters, Jessica and Isabella. By 2017, Fabio was still working for Wella and living near Los Angeles in Woodland Hills, California. However, his relationship with Monica had gone downhill. Fabio was known for having a strong personality and quite an ego, and over time Monica began to resent him. In 2015, she began having an affair with a registered sex offender and former adult film actor by the name of Robert Baker, who served prison time for lewd and lascivious acts with a minor in 1993. These two were obsessed with each other, and in 2016 alone, Monica called Robert over 9,000 times and he called her over 17,000 times. Her hate for Fabio had become so strong that she decided to have him murdered. Part of that plan was to convince Robert that Fabio was a bad guy and that the reward was his life insurance, which was worth $1.6 million. During this time, she continued to play the part of a loving and happy wife. She had access to the surveillance system, which allowed her and Robert to watch a live stream of the house. She also gave him the codes and instruction manual for the security system. They then came up with a date for the murder, January 23rd. She then informed Robert that the housekeeper would be finished by 2:30 p.m. and that her oldest daughter, Jessica, would be at her babysitting job on that day. Late that afternoon, on January 23, 2017, Fabio was alone in the backyard of his home, watching TV, when two people wearing hoodies attacked him from behind. He was beaten and stabbed multiple times. After he was dead, the assailants ransacked the house and removed the DVR from the garage where the home's security footage was stored. Thankfully, a neighbor's security camera captured the two suspects entering the home at 4:18 p.m. and then called them leaving in Fabio's black 2008 Porsche 911 at 4:53 p.m. 2 minutes later, at 4:55 p.m., his 16-year-old daughter Isabella arrived home and noticed bloody shoe prints and blood on the floor. She followed them and sadly found her father's body. As investigators were combing over the scene, they found blood on a sink and had it tested. The results showed that it wasn't Fabio's and instead belonged to an unidentified male. 2 days later, the Porsche was found abandoned about 5 miles from the house. While investigators believed that the crime scene was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong, they let the public believe they thought otherwise. A few days after the murder, family and friends held a memorial at the house, and lo and behold, Robert showed up. Thankfully, he did, because a neighbor who was suspicious of him saw a bandage on his left index finger and snapped a photo. It was that cut on his finger that left blood on the sink at the crime scene. From there, investigators were able to match the crime scene blood to Robert. While Monica denied knowing Robert, investigators were able to find photos of them partying in Las Vegas not long after Fabio's murder. On that same trip, surveillance caught her rubbing the thigh of a bar bouncer and making out with him. 5 months after the murder, Robert and Monica were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Since they were also accused of lying in wait and financial gain, it made them eligible for life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert was given just that after pleading no contest to the murder charge. Monica, however, has pleaded not guilty and is set to go to trial on April 4, 2024. It's believed that another man helped Robert on the day of the murder, but that man has not been identified, or if he has, the name has not been released to the public. Georgie Canaday was born in 1925. In 1973, 48-year-old Georgie was living in Delaware County near Oklahoma. She was described as a tough, but all-around nice person. She had cared for her father until he died at the age of 99. She then moved into the house her father left behind. She was pretty much a recluse who rarely left the home. She had also been declared incompetent in Mexico and suffered from tachycardia, also known as rapid heart rate, and suffered from blackouts. She apparently kept her medical conditions a secret from her family. This might also explain why she rarely left her home. 3 months after her father's death on June 28, 1973, Bill Liu, a Delaware County undersheriff, discovered Georgie's body after an insurance investigator went to her home and became suspicious when she failed to answer the door. The undersheriff kicked open the back door and found Georgie's body in an upstairs bedroom wrapped in a rug. There was also a small amount of blood found on a nearby bed. Her ultimate cause of death was strangulation, and they estimated she had been dead between 5 and 7 days. However, it was later discovered that she was last seen on June 26 when she stopped by Bird's house to pick up her mail and visit with them. They probably thought she had been dead longer because of the decomposition, which was made worse by the 90-degree temperatures around the time of the murder. This also prevented them from determining if she had been sexually assaulted. A few days before her murder, 2 men had shown up at her relative's home where she was and told her the light was on in her attic and she needed to go turn it off. She rudely responded, "Get out of here." These 2 men were questioned, but nothing ever came of it. Robbery was ruled out because her purse was still in the home and had money in it. There were also no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Her family said she was very untrusting of men. They said she would never let a stranger in her home, and because of that, they believed her killer was someone she knew extremely well. Unfortunately, the case would remain unsolved for the next 50 years. In October of 2021, Christina ASP had taken an interest in her great-aunt's murder and began poring through old photographs. She eventually called the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation to inquire about the case. Unfortunately, investigators were unable to locate crime scene photographs, reports, evidence, and other important case files. So Stephanie Bishop, a member of the Cold Case Unit, began going through old newspaper archives to learn more about the case. After a few weeks, they have constructed an entire new file with old interviews, new interviews, a crime scene summary, and old newspaper articles. In July of 2023, a woman came forward and told a secret her father had kept for 40 years. Her father had bought the old Kennedy home and became good friends with one neighbor who eventually died from cancer. On the man's deathbed, he told her father that he, along with 2 other men, had murdered Georgie. He said that he hadn't planned to kill her, but things got out of hand. Unfortunately, he never named the other 2 men. From this, investigators were able to positively identify 2 men that they believe murdered Georgie. The first was the man who confessed on his deathbed. He was said to be a strange person with very quirky behaviors. He was known for carrying a gun and sneaking around back roads in rural Delaware County. He always thought people were stealing his cattle. This man was interviewed after Georgie's murder and told investigators he saw and heard a dark-colored Ford and Chevrolet pickup truck turn around at Teague's Corner at 3 p.m. on June 25th. He has since passed away in 1994. The other suspect was a 16-year-old local boy who had a history of strangling women. This boy was also known for telling people he was attracted to older women instead of girls his own age. His family also had a key to Georgie's home. Georgie had told the family that the boy had come over and jumped up and down on her bed. After that, she refused to allow him to come over. He passed away in 2020. If there really was a third man, he has never been identified and likely will never be. Unfortunately, there are no photos of the identified killers and their names have not been released. In 2001, a woman was loading her 3-year-old toddler into his car seat in the parking lot of their apartment complex when an unknown man approached her from behind and forced her into the vehicle with a sharp object pointed at her back. He then covered her face with her son's baby blanket and drove her to an unknown location where he proceeded to sexually assault her all while her child was in the back seat. The man then drove to a final location where he left the woman, her son, and the car and fled. She immediately went and reported the assault and then went to the hospital where DNA was collected using a sexual assault kit. Unfortunately, the DNA would go untested for nearly 20 years. In 2019, as part of the Dallas County Sex Assault Kit Initiative, the DNA from her case was finally tested. They also began trying to match her case to other similar cases and found one from 1996. In that case, a young pregnant woman was walking to the bus stop early in the morning on her way to work when an unknown man wearing a ski mask came up behind her, covered her eyes with a jacket, put a gun to her head, and threatened to kill her if she screamed. Then he dragged her to a nearby field and sexually assaulted her at gunpoint. Afterward, he fled the scene. Just like the first case, the woman immediately reported the assault and had a sexual assault kit done at the hospital. At the time, the assailant could not be located. It was uploaded to Cody's and matched to 61-year-old Adrian Cortez. He was then arrested and charged with their sexual assaults. Both victims were thankfully still alive and were able to testify at his trial. In the end, it took the jury only 19 minutes to find him guilty, and he was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Carrie Ann Medlin was born on October 9, 1970 to parents Charlotte and Jerry. In 1979, 8-year-old Carrie, a student at Martin Elementary School, was living in Greenfield, Tennessee with her mother, stepfather, and stepbrother. Her stepfather worked at the Goodyear tire plant in Union City, and her mother was a nurse at Jackson Hospital. On Labor Day weekend, September 1, 1979, Carrie and her stepbrother were riding their bicycles in the neighborhood near their home when a man pulled up next to them in a Gran Torino. He struck up a conversation and began acting like he knew their father and needed directions to his house. So Carrie got in his car to show him the way. After getting in, she was sadly never seen alive again. Her family, friends, and neighbors joined together in a massive search for her, and 2 days later, her body was found. An autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Shortly after the murder, a man named Robert Glenn Coe, who had a long history of drug abuse, crimes, and mental health issues, told his family that he had killed someone, but they didn't initially believe him. Once they realized he was serious, they agreed to help him get out of town and subsequently bought him a bus ticket to Georgia. Meanwhile, one family member called and notified the police. Police were thankfully able to get to the bus station before he left and took him into custody. After being arrested, Coe confessed to the murder and described the day in detail. He said that on Saturday, September 1, 1979, he was out getting parts for the Carroll County Collision Body Shop where he worked when he got the urge to flash someone. Unable to find anyone, he returned to work and finished his shift. Later on, still in the mood to flash someone, he drove around Greenfield in his 1972 Ford Torino until he saw Carrie and her stepbrother. He then convinced her to leave her bicycle at a nearby church and get in the car with him to go see her stepfather. Her brother, on the other hand, was left behind at the church to watch the bicycles. The only time Carrie spoke was when she noticed he wasn't going the right way. He said she asked him where they were going, and he responded that they were going for a ride. After that, he said she hung her head down and never said another word. He continued driving around until he found a secluded place to park. Once parked, he sexually assaulted her. After he was done, she kept telling him that Jesus loved him, which angered him, so he jerked her out of the car and tried to choke her. When that didn't work, he stabbed her to death. After leaving, he threw the knife out of the car window and drove to a family member's home to look for his wife, but she wasn't there. As he continued driving around looking for her, he realized he left footprints behind, so he took off his flip-flops and threw those out as well. 2 days later, Coe dyed his hair dark black and traded in his 1972 Ford Torino for a 1972 Mustang at Crestview Motor in Gleason. He told his wife that he had changed his hair color because he had stabbed a state trooper in Camden. He then explained that he needed to get out of town, so they took him to the bus station in Huntington, where he planned to travel under the name James Watson. However, before his 1981 trial, Coe recanted his confession and his defense attorney had him plead insanity. During the trial, Coe lost his cool and cursed and spat at the prosecutors. So he was gagged and removed from the courtroom to watch the remainder of the trial from a television in another room. In the end, he was convicted and sentenced to death. 21 years later, on April 19th, he was executed in Nashville, Tennessee by lethal injection. It's also of note that he was the first inmate to be executed in the state in 40 years. Surprisingly, 30 of his family and friends showed up to celebrate his life. The life of a man convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering a child. Deshaun Martinez was unfortunately born in a nightmare by his parents Anthony and Elizabeth in 2015. In 2020, he and his parents, along with his 3 siblings and grandmother and Martinez, were living in Flagstaff, Arizona. His parents were druggies and would keep Deshaun and his 7-year-old brother in a 21 by 25-inch closet for roughly 16 hours a day. Inside the closet, all they had to sleep on was an orange piece of plastic on the floor. In 2013, before Deshaun was born, His parents were investigated by DCS after they received 2 different allegations of abuse towards one of their other children. However, DCS closed the case and said the claims were unsubstantiated. In March of 2020, Deshawn's grandmother called 911 to report that one of the children was unresponsive inside the apartment. When emergency responders arrived, they found Deshawn dead from severe starvation. His parents tried to say that Deshawn was malnourished due to a medical condition and that he died after stealing and taking their diet and caffeine pills. At the time of Deshawn's death, he weighed only 34 pounds and had non-life-threatening abrasions and bruises all over his body. Dacon's 7-year-old brother, whom he shared the closet with, was rushed to the Flagstaff Medical Center while the 2 youngest children, 2 girls ages 2 and 4, were removed from the home and placed in the custody of DCS. Strangely, the 2 girls were not malnourished at all. As for Dacon, his parents kept lying, saying that despite feeding him a lot, he would not gain weight. They also claimed that they were on a budget and waiting on food stamps. Eventually, they confessed that the boys were kept in a locked closet and were given very little to eat as punishment for stealing food at night. They were kept in the closet every day from 8 p.m. to 12 p.m. the next day when they were allowed to eat oatmeal. For hours later, they would be given a cheese sandwich. In the end, all 3 adults in the home, Elizabeth, Anthony, and Ann, were charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and child abuse. Elizabeth had been addicted to meth from birth and had a very traumatic upbringing and suffered severe mental issues. It wasn't helped by her husband Anthony and his mother Ann, who she said inflicted physical and emotional abuse toward her on a daily basis. She even told her attorney that she felt more free in prison than she ever did with Anthony. In the end, she was sentenced to life in prison. The children were eventually placed in a foster family. Their foster mother said that Deshawn's brother was so traumatized about food and eating that he would ask every 5 minutes when the next meal was. He also kept a special little lunchbox with snacks in it by his side at all times. As for their sisters, they are also doing better, but it took 3 years for one of them to speak. As for Anthony and Ann, they remain in jail awaiting trial. Jacqueline Hartenstein Lard was born to parents Charles and Rebecca Hartenstein on June 23, 1946, in Maryland. In 1986, 40-year-old Jacqueline, a mother of 2, was living in Stafford County, Virginia, and was married to Ronald Lard, a DEA employee. On November 14, 1986, Jacqueline was working late at the Mount Vernon Realty with another female coworker. Around 9 p.m., they decided to head home, and Jacqueline told her coworker, and I quote, "I'm gathering my stuff. I'll be right behind you." Sadly, she would never make it home that night. The following morning, when employees showed up to the office, they found blood in the hallway near the back door to their office. However, Jacqueline and her vehicle were both missing. Police and the FBI knew they had a missing person and collected the blood and other evidence from the scene. One day later, some teenagers walking through a wooded area off Route 1 in Woodbridge, Virginia, about 20 miles north of the Realty office, found Jacqueline's partially clothed body underneath a pile of discarded carpet. A month after her murder, on December 18, 1986, her 1986 Nissan was discovered abandoned 25 miles away at Bryn Mawr apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. Her husband, Ronald, was immediately ruled out because he was out of the country at the time of her murder. Over the years, the FBI ruled out multiple suspects and persons of interest and even released a sketch of a man they wanted to question about the murder. The sketch was created based on information provided by 2 witnesses who said that on the weekend of Jacqueline's murder, they saw a man who they described as being 6 feet tall in his mid-20s, heavyset with acne scars in the vicinity of where her body was found. While they didn't believe the man was a suspect in the case, they did say he fit the profile of the killer. Investigators said that while the murderer went to great lengths to remove incriminating evidence from the scene, including fingerprints and hair, not all was removed, including an impression of the man's sneakers. Unfortunately, since the case was most likely a crime of opportunity, it made solving it even more difficult. Thankfully, they were able to retrieve DNA evidence, but over the years, searches in the Cody's database turned up no results. 3 years after her murder on March 29, 1989, 18-year-old Amy Baker of Stafford Virginia was visiting family in Falls Church. She started her drive back home around 8:30 p.m., but would sadly never make it. Around 9:55 p.m. that same night, a Virginia state trooper discovered Amy's blue Volkswagen Beetle abandoned on the side of the road. The following day, when the car was still there, the trooper had it towed. When Amy's mother learned about the car being towed, she went and searched inside and found her daughter's belongings. 2 days after Amy's disappearance, her family searched the area where the car was found and sadly found Amy's body in a wooded area near the Backlick Road exit on I-95 in Springfield. Investigators determined that she had run out of gas on the exit ramp and began walking to a gas station when she encountered her killer. She was then sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Unfortunately, just like Jacqueline's case, it would remain unsolved for years. In 2021, investigators had the DNA sent to Pairbond Nanolabs and a DNA profile was created. When the profile was uploaded to the Virginia State Database, it revealed that the same man had murdered both Amy and Jacqueline. On December 14, 2023, with the use of genetic genealogy and investigative work, the suspect was identified as 65-year-old Elroy Neal Harrison. He was then indicted for first-degree murder, abduction with the intent to defile, and aggravated malicious wounding of Jacqueline, as well as breaking and entering with the intent to commit murder. He was arrested at his home the following day. He is currently awaiting trial for Jacqueline's murder, but hasn't been charged in Amy's case yet. Irma Sipple was born on August 27, 1945, in Denver, Colorado. In 1946, 10-month-old Irma was living in Tennessee with her toddler brother and her mother Alma in a one-room apartment. One day, a woman from the Tennessee Children's Home Society came to the apartment and said she was investigating alleged child abuse involving a neighbor. The woman had strangely pulled up in a black limousine, and upon seeing baby Irma and her runny nose, she asked, "Your baby's sick, isn't she? You should get her a checkup." Since the woman didn't have any money, the woman, who identified herself as Georgia Tan, offered to take Irma to the Memphis General Hospital. Alma agreed, and all she had to do was sign some paperwork. After signing the paperwork, to Alma's shock, Georgia took Irma and told her she couldn't come along. The following day, Alma went down to the hospital and saw Irma, who was feeling much better. However, to her shock, when she asked to take her home, the nurse told her that all the children belonged to the Children's Home Society. Alma left and began calling Georgia. When Georgia finally returned her call, she told her that Irma had died of pneumonia. Alma at least wanted her daughter so she could bury her, but she was told that Irma had already been buried. Alma would spend the next 44 years believing her daughter was dead. Until one night when she was watching Unsolved Mysteries and a story came on about thousands of children who had been kidnapped in the organization that was trying to help reconnect the children with their parents. On a hunch, called The Number, and 7 months later, she was reunited with Irma. Irma was now an adult living in Cincinnati, and her foster family renamed her Sandra Kimbrell, and she went by Sandy. Sandy graduated with an associate's degree in nursing in 1975 and worked a long career at Cincinnati Children's Hospital as a perioperative nurse in the cardiology unit. She then worked in nurse management at the Jewish Hospital in Cincinnati before moving to York, Pennsylvania in 1991. There she worked at the Hershey Medical Center and Memorial Hospital. After retiring in 2006, she moved back to her hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. She sadly died in 2022 at the age of 76, and her obituary read, "Sandy was born on August 27, 1945 in Denver, Colorado to Snow and Francis Smart." I'm not sure why it wasn't updated to include her birth mother, Alma Sipple. As for Georgia Tan, she was responsible for kidnapping an estimated 5,000 children. Georgia was born on July 18, 1891. In Philadelphia, Mississippi, to Beulah and George Clark Tan, and had a 3-year-old brother, Rob Roy Tan. Her father, George, was a district court judge and really wanted his daughter to become a concert pianist. So from the age of 5, he put her in piano lessons. After high school, Georgia enrolled at Martha Washington College in Abingdon, Virginia, where she graduated in 1913 with a degree in music. The kicker was that she hated playing the piano and wanted to be an attorney like her father. Her father agreed to teach her and she passed the state bar exam in Mississippi. However, he still wouldn't allow her to practice law. So she turned to social work and got a job with the Mississippi Children's Home Society, working as the receiving director at the Kate McWheely Powers Receiving Home for Children. Even though adoption at the time wasn't looked at favorably, Georgia felt differently, and in 1922, she adopted a baby girl and named her June. Around this time, she met an Atwood, who was 8 years younger than Georgia, and the two began secretly dating. In 1924, Georgia was terminated from the Society for questionable child placing methods. So she, along with June and Anne's baby boy Jack, moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Also around this time, and added the last name Hollingsworth to her name, most likely to give the impression she was widowed since giving birth out of wedlock was frowned upon. Once in Memphis, Georgia was hired as the executive secretary for the Tennessee Children's Home Society. It wasn't long before she weaseled herself to the top of the company, eventually becoming the head of the organization. This is when she began trafficking children. Just like the laws today, Tennessee had laws in place that forbade the selling of children and only allowed agencies to charge for their services. Today's adoption costs can range from $20,000 to $60,000 and more, but back then, the society typically charged $7. However, Georgia began taking children to New York and California and would charge as much as $700 for the adoption. The money was paid by check, and not written out to the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but to Georgia herself. An estimated 3,000 children were adopted by parents in New York and California between 1940 and 1950. A lot of the families were very wealthy, and Georgia would get every penny out of them she could, such as charging for background checks that never happened, or charging insane amounts for airline tickets. However, some of the children were sold to families to be used as child labor on farms. All the money she received was placed in a secret bank account under a false corporation. Most of the money she received she took for herself and didn't report it to the society or the IRS. While she was clearly selling children, the worst part was where the children were coming from. If you're going to run a scam, you have to have a good amount of product. Since adoption at the time wasn't looked at favorably, there weren't people lining up at the society's doors to give up their babies. So Georgia used illegal and unethical tactics to get the babies. Just like she did with Irma, she would dupe unsuspecting parents into turning custody over to her. It was basically the largest child kidnapping organization in the country, and children were disappearing from all over the place. Sometimes, even entire groups of siblings would go missing while walking to or from school. Other times, she would take the children directly from the nursery schools, and parents would later be told welfare agents took their child. She would even take newborns until the birth mothers the child died. Most of the women she took babies from were single mothers who at the time couldn't fight back. In order to pull this off, she hired spotters who would watch around town for children that could be taken by the society. Sometimes they wouldn't even report back, but instead take the children right there on the spot from playgrounds and other locations. It wasn't helped that she had people in power on her payroll such as the local judge, Camille Kelly, and politician E.H. Crump, aka the Boss, who was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives in Tennessee from 1931 to 1935 and then served on the Democratic National Committee until 1945. Once Georgia had the children in her custody, she would destroy their records in hopes that the birth families could never find them. Then new birth certificates were created with the support of Judge Camille Kelly. Judge Kelly would even have children removed from divorced mothers and hand them over to Georgia. Unfortunately, the children in Georgia's care were often mistreated physically and sexually and sometimes even starved to death. These deaths put Memphis at the top of the nation's infant mortality rate. Hundreds of children who died were buried in unmarked graves with no death certificates. To help with the lack of housing, a businessman donated the mansion at 1556 Poplar Avenue to Georgia and the society. The bottom floor of the mansion was turned into offices and intake rooms, while the top floor was used as a nursery. However, Georgia continued to ignore doctors' recommendations and didn't provide the children with the necessary medicine when they were sick. To this day, the number of children who died in Georgia's care, or lack thereof, is unknown, but it's estimated to be around 500. By the 1940s, things were slowly crashing down. In 1941, the Child Welfare League of America dropped the Tennessee Society from its list of qualifying institutions. Then in 1950, politician E.H. Crump lost his power and Judge Camille Kelly was forced to resign. On September 11, 1950, the then governor of Tennessee, Gordon Browning, launched an investigation into the society after receiving reports that the agency was selling children for profit. For days later, Georgia died of uterine cancer. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was subsequently closed the same year. While New York and California vowed to correct the adoptions, nothing was ever done, and the estimated 5,000 children were left with their new families. H. Crump and Judge Camille Kelly were never charged. And Crump died in 1954 and Kelly died in 1955. As for her partner, Anne Atwood Hollingsworth, she lived until the age of 96 and died in 1995. Vicki Lynn Belk was born in Alexandria, Virginia to parents Lonnie and Maydale Casey on March 20, 1951, and was the eldest of 6 siblings. She attended Minnie Howard Elementary School and then graduated from T.C. Williams High School in 1969. After high school, she enrolled at St. Augustine's University and became the first member of her family to graduate from college. In 1979, 28-year-old Vicki was working as a management analyst for the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. She also had a 7-year-old son named Lamont. It seemed like she had everything going for her until August of 1979 when tragedy struck. On August 27th, Vicki and her boyfriend, James Hill, also an Agriculture Department employee, rode in his 1972 Buick from their apartment in Prince George's County to the Stadium Ormery station, where they left the car and took a train to work. However, at lunchtime, Vicki left and took the train back to the car, so she could run some errands with plans to pick James back up after work. However, when James arrived at the parking lot that evening, Vicki was nowhere to be found. He spent the night calling around to friends and family, but no one had seen her. The following day, he reported her missing. 2 days later, a teenager riding his bike along a path near Bryant Road and Metropolitan Church Road in Charles County, Maryland, 25 miles south of D.C., found her body. Sadly, she had been sexually assaulted and shot to death. Thankfully, they were able to collect DNA, which helped solve the case 44 years later. In early 2022, the evidence was reevaluated and her clothes were submitted for DNA testing. To the investigators' surprise, when it was uploaded to Cody's, a match was found and linked to 62-year-old Andre Taylor. Taylor was a few months shy of his 19th birthday when he abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered Vicki. He lived at his aunt's home, only 4 miles from where her body was found. Over the years, he amassed a long criminal record that consisted of violent crimes. In 1989, he was convicted for the murder of a man he fatally shot during a street robbery. After he was released, his crimes continued. When Taylor, now an amputee with one leg, was arrested and charged with her murder, he was living in a nursing home in D.C. Taylor remains in jail, awaiting trial. Taylor Ashley Wright was born on April 23, 1984, and grew up in South Carolina. Those who knew Taylor said she was a very compassionate, outgoing, charismatic, and funny individual. At some point, she married Jeff Wright and they had a son together. However, by 2017, 33-year-old Taylor, who was now living in Pensacola, Florida, was in the middle of a divorce and custody battle with Jeff and was working as a private investigator. Before moving to Pensacola, she worked as a police officer in Jacksonville from 2008 to 2009, and then again from 2012 to 2013. While in Pensacola, she met Ashley Britt MacArthur, a former crime scene investigator, and the two women became very close friends. She also met Cassandra Waller online, and the two began dating and eventually moved in together. On September 8, 2017, Taylor withdrew $34,000 from her and Jeff's joint account. Afterwards, she met up with Ashley and entrusted her with the money until her divorce was final. She then mysteriously vanished. By September 14th, when Cassandra had not heard from Taylor in several days, she reported her missing. Investigators searched her apartment, but there was nothing missing. All her personal belongings were still there and her car was parked outside. Investigators began thinking she might have just gone out of town after Cassandra received a text from Taylor's phone saying she needed to get away for a few days. There were also multiple people who came forward and reported seeing her after she went missing. This goes to show you how inaccurate witness sightings are because, as you'll see in the end, they never saw her. Her family knew she was not the type of person to just up and leave and began fearing the worst. Plus, Cassandra was used to Taylor's text messages and the last text she received from her felt off. When they first questioned Ashley, she told them that Jeff was aggressive and had been violent with Taylor leading up to the divorce. This put Jeff at the top of the suspect list, but he was quickly ruled out because he was hundreds of miles away out of town on the day she disappeared. She also said that after giving Taylor the money, she left with it in a duffel bag and she never saw her again. Investigators decided to question Ashley's boyfriend and they were shocked at the stuff he told them. Here's a clip of that interview. How well do you trust Ashley? I don't trust her at all. You don't trust her with your freedom? Hell no. I'll catch her in two of your eyes. Your feelings on all this missing person and her talking to you, what's your thoughts? There's more to the story. I don't know. She's point blank. Said they are not going to find her. She took that money and left. What do you think about that? Don't make no sense. Since she was possibly the last person to see Taylor, this immediately made her a person of interest. Suspicions began to rise even further when investigators found that she had deposited the $34,000 cashier's check in Taylor's name to her own bank account. She then took the money out and placed it in a safe deposit box. However, they noticed that some of that money ended back up in Ashley's bank account. During a second interview, Ashley tells them that after giving Taylor the money, they went horseback riding in East Milton, 20 miles away from Pensacola. They then went their separate ways after arriving back at Ashley's home. When they questioned Ashley about the money, she said that Taylor was drawing large amounts of money out and hiding it until her divorce was final. As they continued investigating Ashley, they would stumble on multiple things that would break the case wide open. First, Ashley said that she went to a wedding in Alabama, but they also discovered that Taylor's phone was pinging from that same location even though they weren't together. So why was Taylor's phone with Ashley? They also discovered that they weren't in East Milton at the time Ashley said they were. They had actually first gone in the opposite direction to Ashley's family's farm. When confronted with this, Ashley acknowledged they had gone by the farm. When asked why, she said that Taylor needed to get some kind of lockbox she had left there. Here's the moment. Ashley is confronted with that information. Investigators also discovered that Ashley had been cashing forged checks and was caught skimming thousands of dollars from jukeboxes that her family rented to various bars. On October 9, 2017, officials got a search warrant for her family's farm on Britt Road, north of Pensacola. Within 2 hours of arriving, they stumbled upon a shallow grave covered with concrete. After opening it, they sadly found Taylor's remains, who had been shot and wrapped up in a hammock. They then got a search warrant for Ashley's home and found Taylor's passport and a gun with one bullet missing. She was then arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Leading up to Taylor's murder, she was trying to collect the $34,000 from Ashley, but was given multiple excuses why they couldn't go to the bank. Finally, Ashley agreed to take her on September 8, 2017. The day she disappeared. After Taylor left to go meet up with her, Cassandra strangely got a call from Ashley saying that she was taking Taylor to ride horses in East Milton instead of going to the bank. Cassandra was immediately concerned and sent Taylor a text but didn't receive a reply until 7 p.m. The text she received said, "I'll call you later. I'm not angry with you and I should have called, but I just need to think. I'm trying to get my life organized and on track." Investigators theorized that Taylor found out about the money missing and it caused an argument, which eventually led to Ashley shooting her. What they probably didn't realize was that Ashley had been planning Taylor's murder for a while and was talking to a friend about it. That friend came forward and told investigators everything. She said that Ashley was planning to put drugs in Taylor's beer, but ultimately decided to shoot her instead. She also said that Ashley called Taylor a horrible person and said the world would be better off without her. They believe when Ashley took her to the farm that day, she shot her execution style. On October 23, 2019, Ashley was found guilty of premeditated first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She also received another 7 years in prison for racketeering and fraud charges for stealing from her family's business. Daniel Ashton Walker Jr. was born in 1952 and grew up in Illinois. After high school, he enrolled in college, but quickly found himself on the road, traveling and working in several different states, eventually ending up in Europe. By the summer of 1974, he was back in the United States, working as a carpenter in Denver, Colorado, when family members of his in Santa Ana invited him to join them in California. Once there, he began working for a Costa Mesa sailboat manufacturer. His family said he was a very outgoing person who would always go out of his way to do a favor for people. Unfortunately, this would lead to Daniel's untimely demise. By the end of the summer, Daniel was ready to move on. He didn't like the crowds and congestion of Southern California and decided to head back to Colorado. On September 30th, 1974, 22-year-old Daniel was driving through Cajon Pass, north of San Bernardino, California, when he saw an 18-year-old man from Texas who needed a ride. This was not out of character because Daniel was known for picking up a hitchhiker. The man said he needed to go to Flagstaff, Arizona, and even though it was out of his way, Daniel agreed to take him. At about 1 a.m. on October 1st, after the passenger had already fallen asleep in the back, Daniel pulled his blue Volkswagen van over on the side of Interstate 40, about 62 miles west of Needles, so that he could get some rest as well. At about 6 or 6:30 a.m., while he and his passenger slept, someone came up to the van and shot Daniel with 4 blasts from a shotgun. His passenger heard the commotion and Daniel begging for his life before the shots were fired. When he heard the vehicle speed off, he looked out the window and saw a gold 1968 or 1969 Chevrolet or GMC model van fleeing the scene. He quickly flagged down 2 passing motorists, hoping to get some help for Daniel, who was dying from the gunshot wounds. A trucker also stopped and notified the police using his CB radio. The passenger described the killers as 2 white men in their early 20s. The motorists who were flagged down rushed Daniel to Needles Hospital, but unfortunately, he died from his injuries. The suspects only stole $80 from Daniel, but failed to take any other valuables. 33 miles west of the crime scene, the same man had flagged down a delivery man. The men had gotten their vehicles stuck in the sand, and the delivery driver pulled them out. He said that one of the men told him he was going back to Indiana to find his wife and children. They also said they just traded in another vehicle for their gold van, and that they had a shotgun they were using to shoot down posts and sagebrush that they were using to get the van unstuck. After the delivery driver helped them get unstuck, they offered him money, but he declined and they all went on their way. The killer would elude police for decades until finally in January 2024, one of the men was identified as serial murderer Thomas Eugene Creech. 73-year-old Creech was already in prison, serving his time on death row, and is actually Idaho's longest-serving death row inmate. Creech was arrested for the November 1974 double murder of 2 house painters, 40-year-old John Wayne Bradford and 34-year-old Edward Thomas Arnold. While on trial for the crime in 1975, he confessed to 42 other killings around the country. In the end, the real number was fewer than 14, and he was only convicted for 5 of those. In addition to Bradford and Arnold, his other victims were William Joseph Dean in Portland, Oregon, Vivian Grant Robinson in Sacramento, California, and fellow inmate David Dale Jensen. Since Creech is already on death row, it remains unclear if they will officially charge him in the case. Also, the other suspect has not been identified, but considering Creech's past, he is most likely the one who pulled the trigger that killed Daniel. Linda and O'Keefe was born on May 24, 1962 in Newport Beach, California to parents Richard and Barbara. In 1973, 11-year-old Linda was still living in Newport Beach, was a member of the local youth center, and loved piano, painting, and crafts. She attended Lincoln Elementary School in Corona del Mar, which was close enough for her to ride her bicycle. However, on July 6, 1973, her piano teacher gave her a ride to summer school because she was going to walk home afterward. After her second class, she walked to a nearby store called Richard's Market and bought some bubble gum before returning to school in time for her third class. When summer school ended around lunch that day, she decided not to walk and instead went to the school's secretary and asked to use the phone so she could call her mother and ask for a ride. However, the secretary told her she would have to wait. Instead of waiting, she went back to Richard's Market where she saw her friend Brenda. When they left the store, a turquoise van almost hit Brenda, but she was thankfully able to jump out of the way. However, the van stopped near Linda, who was further away. Brenda was too far away to see if the driver and Linda were talking. After the encounter, Linda went back to the school. She was finally allowed to use the phone, but her mother said she was busy with a sewing project and told her to walk home. Linda hated walking home, and when her mother refused to get her, she was mad and hung up and began crying. After walking out of the school, she went and sat down on the corner of Marguerite Drive and Inlet Drive. Sadly, she never made it home that day. When she failed to show up for lunch, her mother became worried and began calling around. Once her husband was home, they both went out looking for her. By 6:42 p.m., when there was still no sign of Linda, they reported her missing. Police began a massive search involving helicopters, but by the end of the day, there was still no sign of her. They finally had a break in the case when a little girl named Janine told officers that as she and her mother were driving, they saw Linda sitting on the corner with a turquoise van parked at the intersection. Janine's mother felt something wasn't right and stopped and parked just down a little ways from where Linda was. When the van left, she planned to write down the license plate, but it turned before reaching her. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to see if Linda was inside, but she did note that Linda was gone. Around this time, a woman who lived nearby said she heard a scream, but didn't think much of it until she found out that Linda was missing. The following day, a man who lived about a mile away from Linda's house took his 4-year-old son to a nearby lake to look for frogs. It was there he found Linda's body down in a ditch. At first, he thought she was sleeping, so he reached out and touched her hand. When she didn't respond, he quickly returned home and called the police. It was determined that Linda had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Unfortunately, with only a description of the suspect and his van, the case would go unsolved for the next 40-plus years. On July 7, 2018, the 45th anniversary of her murder, Newport Police Department announced they were going to partner with Parabon Nanolabs to try and solve the case using DNA. During this time, they also released photos of the clothes she was wearing and new sketches of the suspect. With the use of genetic genealogy and investigative leads, they were able to identify the killer as 73-year-old James Allen Neal, a.k.a. James Albert Layton Jr. Layton, was born on July 28, 1946 in Chicago, Illinois, and was the middle child. His family moved to California in 1955, and 4 years later was the start of his long criminal career. His first charge was for burglary in August of 1959, and once again in October of 1959. After the second arrest, he was sent to juvie and paroled on July 1, 1961, but was placed back in juvie on October 16, 1962. He was once again paroled on August 27, 1963, but arrested once again in September 1964. This time, he was tried as an adult and sentenced to 9 months in the Orange County Jail for second-degree burglary. A year later, he was arrested for suspicion of burglary, but it was later dismissed. His parole officer said he had a difficult time forming relationships and holding down a job. After leaving California, he went to Ohio and then to Kentucky, where he trained in a dentist office. That wouldn't last, and he would end up in Denver in August of 1966. Once there, he got a job at a gas station but was once again accused of stealing. Police said Layton was a chronic liar and would tell people he met that he was married and his wife was pregnant, and that was also his excuse for stealing. He was then arrested in Utah and then returned to Denver, where he was charged with larceny. He was paroled for that crime on July 14, 1971, 2 years before he abducted and murdered Linda. He was arrested again in September of 1973 in Florida, and then again in Denver in 1974 on a parole violation. He was once again paroled in 1975. At some point, while James was in Florida, he changed his name from Layton to Neal and his middle name from Albert to Allen. As for Linda's murder, investigators eventually tracked him down to Monument, Colorado, and arrested him in February 2019. He was then charged with Linda's murder, but he was also charged for a case in California dating back to 2002 where he was accused of lewd and lascivious acts. He pleaded not guilty to both charges but would never go to trial because on May 25, 2020, he was rushed to the hospital with an undisclosed illness and died a few days later. Sadly, Linda's parents passed away before seeing the case solved. In 1991, 30-year-old Sherry Bridgewater was a mother of two living in an apartment in the 1000 block of Monroe Avenue in Las Vegas, Nevada. In May of 1991, a friend and a relative of Sherry's went by her apartment for a visit and shockingly found her body. Authorities were called and they determined she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Unfortunately, with very little to go on, the case would go cold for decades. In 2013, advancements in technology allowed detectives to submit the sexual assault kit from the case for DNA examination. Through that examination, police were able to develop a suspect profile of the person believed to have killed Sherry. After submitting the profile to Cody's, Las Vegas Metro Police learned that Sherry's killer was also connected to a second unsolved murder in Westminster, Colorado. 20-year-old Terry Becker was last seen on December 4, 1975, while hitchhiking to see her boyfriend in Brighton, Colorado. Her family described her as a free spirit who enjoyed living life on the edge. 2 days later, two passing motorists discovered Terry's body in an agricultural field in the area of 100th Avenue and Lowell Boulevard in Westminster, about 10 miles north of Denver, along with her clothes and personal items. She had tragically been sexually assaulted and strangled to death before being left in a field. She was remembered as being able to hold a conversation with anyone and enjoying painting and listening to music. It was determined that the same person had killed both Sherry and Terry, but it would be another decade before they could figure out who it was. Investigators decided to submit the case to Parbon Nanolabs and then to Solves by DNA in Denver, Colorado in 2018 for forensic genealogy. 5 years later, the suspect was identified as career criminal Thomas Martin Elliott. Westminster police said it took so long because tracing Thomas's genetic DNA was a challenge as his parents had divorced and he was adopted by his stepfather whose last name he used. Investigators were able to place Thomas in Colorado at the time of Terry's murder and in Las Vegas at the time of Sherry's murder. He was arrested in Colorado for a burglary charge around the time of Terry's murder. He was then taken to Carson City where he served his time. Shortly after he was released in 1981, he committed a sexual assault on a 13-year-old girl in Carson City and was once again arrested and remained in prison until he was paroled in 1991. After being released, he murdered Sherry. 6 months later, he took his own life. To be certain he was Sherry's killer, his body was exhumed in October 2023, and DNA was collected from tissue and bone samples. Those samples were then confirmed to be a match from both homicides, officially solving Terry's case after 48 years and Sherry's case after 32 years. Police later added that Thomas possibly met Sherry at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Unfortunately, Sherry's parents died before Thomas was identified. However, police notified both of her adult sons and brought some long-awaited closure to her family. On September 9, 1985, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office received a call about a body in the 1100 block of North Market Street in the Springfield neighborhood of Jacksonville. The victim was identified as 38-year-old Annie Mae Ernest, and the cause of death was ruled a homicide. The last person to see Annie alive was 39-year-old Robert Vance, who openly admitted to being with her on the night of the murder. He then agreed to come in for questioning and to take a polygraph, but failed to show up. When investigators went to his apartment, they found it empty and abandoned. At some point, they learned that Robert Vance was an alias and that his real name was Robert Richard Van Pelt. After Annie's murder, Pelt fled to Tampa and began using the name John Leroy Harris. Unfortunately, they were unable to track him down and the case would go unsolved for the next 38 years. In July of 2023, a family member of Annie's contacted cold case detectives and requested an update on her case. This got the wheels turning in the case, and they were finally able to find out what happened to Pilt. Investigators said they used modern technology and databases to discover that after he fled to Tampa, he was accused of shooting a woman in 1988. The victim thankfully survived, but before he could be brought to justice, he took his own life. They then used fingerprint analysis to determine that Robert Vance, John Leroy Harris, and Robert Richard Van Pelt were all the same person. Investigators are certain that Pelt murdered Annie, and if he were alive today, he would be charged in her case. Unfortunately, there are no details about Annie's life, nor is there a photo of Pelt. Alexander Gerald Skill and his twin brother were born in 1995. When they were younger, they became child models for the Asda supermarket chain. During the summer of 2012, 16-year-old Alex unfortunately met and fell in love with Jordan Worth. He saw her as a kind, self-assured, and adorable person. She aspired to become a teacher and appeared to treat everyone kindly. Jordan went on to graduate from the University of Hertfordshire and had even raised money to help children in Africa. Once the relationship was in full motion, Alex's mother, Jed, noticed that Jordan's behavior changed from charming to disturbing. She appeared to play mind games with Alex and would even control how he dressed. She would also complain about how his hair was styled. At first, Alex didn't seem to mind and was only eager to please her and win her approval. Alex's family once took Jordan to the theater in London, and in the middle of the night, she mysteriously disappeared. After a frantic search, they found her an hour later in the hotel lobby giggling. She clearly thought her bizarre actions were amusing, which concerned Alex's family. Then, at Alex's 18th birthday celebration, she insulted a female friend of the family. At this point, Alex had had enough and decided to break up with her. Unbeknownst to the family, Jordan was pregnant and returned a year later in May 2014 with their son TJ. The couple then reconciled with Alex, hoping motherhood would change her strange ways. Now that they were back together, Jordan was allowed to move into Alex's family home. One day, the couple left with their son and went for a drive. While out and about, they spotted the girl Jordan insulted at Alex's birthday party. Jordan then began screaming obscenities at her, and when Alex's mother, Jed, heard about it, she was furious. She told Jordan to stop what she was doing, but all that did was piss her off. So she packed her and her son's things and left. She then gave Alex an ultimatum. If he wanted to be with her, he had to move out of his family's home. Wanting to be close to his son, he made the decision to move into an apartment with her and ceased all communication with his parents. In May 2017, the couple had their second child, a daughter named Iris. At this point, Jordan's control began to escalate. She made him change his phone number to further isolate him from his friends and family. She also hated him playing video games and threw out his PlayStation. She then created a Facebook account in Alex's name and began sending hateful messages to his friends. She also sent Alex's grandfather a text pretending to be Alex and said he never wanted to see him again. She then took her devious actions to the next level by telling Alex his grandfather had died, and when he started crying, she criticized him for caring about his family. As time went by, her possessiveness only worsened. She spent Alex's money and then forced him to resign from his job. When you think it couldn't get any worse than that, she convinced him to ingest an entire box of sleeping pills. To prove that he was not lying about something, she would even physically abuse Alex on a daily basis. One time, she used a bread knife to cut the tendons in his right hand, and another time, she assaulted him with a hairbrush, breaking his tooth during the attack. He couldn't afford a dentist or borrow a car, so his only option was to rip the tooth out. Eventually, it became routine for Jordan to hit Alex with things like hammers, screwdrivers, and knives. She even poured boiling water on his arms and back and would strike him on the head while he slept, causing him to bleed all over the mattress. There were times she wouldn't even let him eat and forced him to sleep on the floor. Alex became malnourished but stayed because he was afraid his children would be in danger if he left. Neighbors eventually called the police after hearing Alex begging her to stop hurting him. When they arrived, he took the blame and told them the wounds were self-inflicted. And Alex has hurt himself. At the top of the stairs, Alex was sat with a towel wrapped around his arm, just blood everywhere. When we questioned it, they were both quite sort of calm and rational and explained that, yeah, no, Alex has this long-standing history of self-harm. Jordan also lied and said Alex had a history of self-harm. The police had Alex go to the hospital to have his wounds treated, but Jordan quickly arrived and forced him to leave, ignoring the medical staff's advice. A few days after the incident, the police were called again, and this time, Sergeant Finn decided to take action. He knocked on the door, and Alex answered. His clothes were covered in grime, and he had numerous wounds covering his malnourished body. Sergeant Finn decided to put Alex in his patrol car, hoping if he got Alex alone, he would finally tell the truth. In a last-ditch effort, Sergeant Finn turned off his police body cam and told Alex it was now just the two of them talking. At that point, Alex agreed to tell him, but only if he agreed to say the information came from neighbors and not from him. He then admitted to being abused by Jordan. Now that he had a confession, Sergeant Finn marched inside the apartment and placed Jordan under arrest. He assumed she would be furious, but instead, she switched on her manipulative personality and tried to kill Sergeant Finn with kindness. Alex was rushed to the hospital to have his burns treated. It was there that doctors told him he was only about 10 days away from death because the burns had become infected. In September 2017, Jordan was charged with 17 offenses including wounding with intent, causing severe bodily injury on purpose and controlling or coercive behavior in a close relationship. After being released from the hospital, Alex returned to his family and was reunited with his children. In 2018, Jordan was sentenced to 7 years in prison and was the first woman in the UK to be found guilty of controlling or coercive behavior. However, she would only serve half her sentence and was released in January 2022. Alex has since admitted that he was so in love with her that he couldn't break away from the abusive relationship. We generally think of abuse as a man abusing a woman, but in the UK, 1/3 of all victims are men. Alex is now working with a domestic violence organization to help educate others who might be in similar situations. While prisoners in the UK are banned from updating their Facebook accounts, someone was posting information on Jordan's account suggesting she was the victim of abuse instead of Alex. Thankfully, Alex has since moved on with his life and Jordan is now engaged to a 28-year-old bricklayer. David Edwards was a well-liked man with a pleasant personality living in Charlie, Lancashire. He was an accomplished defense attorney who took great pride in his job. David eventually fell in love with his best friend, Debbie, and soon after, she became pregnant. He was very excited about fatherhood and attended every one of her appointments. After his daughter was born, he was immediately attached to her and would always rush home from work to be with her. For the first couple of years, David and Debbie were inseparable, but by year 5, their relationship began to deteriorate and they mutually agreed to part ways. 7 months later, 50-year-old David met 41-year-old Sharon Manser. David knew Sharon from years earlier when he defended her ex in court for charges of assault against her. However, he was able to convince the court that she lied about being a victim of domestic violence and helped her former boyfriend avoid jail time. One night after the breakup with Debbie, David was browsing through Facebook and came across Sharon's profile and decided to send her a friend request. Their relationship moved quickly, and in 2014, she moved into his house. This is when the real nightmare began. One day, David went to pick up his daughter from Debbie and noticed he was drunk and in excruciating pain. She asked him what was wrong, and he said he had fractured his collarbone after falling down the stairs. But Debbie was immediately skeptical of the story. When Debbie first met Sharon, David and she had shown up drunk and attempted to get his daughter. However, Debbie refused and requested David come back when he was sober. This pissed off Sharon, who returned later, trying to beat and kick Debbie's door down, demanding to talk about the situation. David was known for being upbeat and generally in the mood to talk. However, over time, his demeanor began to change. One day, he went to pick up his daughter, and Debbie noticed he had a black eye and was covered in bruises and scratches. He then lied to her and told her the injuries were from accidents that occurred around the home. On June 21, 2015, David planned to spend Father's Day with his daughter but canceled at the last minute. Debbie knew what his daughter meant to him and felt something was off. So, She rushed over to his house to find out what was going on. When he answered the door, she immediately saw a handprint around his neck along with severe cuts, and his lip was split open. He told her he didn't want his daughter to see him like this and once again claimed the injuries were from accidents around the home. However, Debbie knew better, but David refused to go to the police. David and Sharon eventually took a trip to Las Vegas, and while there on June 28, 2015, the couple married. Even on their wedding day, the abuse didn't stop. The couple had gotten into an argument which ended with Sharon throwing a phone at David, injuring his eye. While Sharon tried to conceal his injury for wedding photos, you could still see it. At this point, she forced David to stop communicating with Debbie about their daughter, requiring her to go through Sharon. The abuse got so bad that David lost weight and began missing work. When he was at work, Sharon would randomly show up to make sure he was there and would even yell at his coworkers when she couldn't see him. Those close to David began advising him to end the relationship after he told them that she beat him with a coffee table and an ashtray. Debbie was at the point where she feared for her daughter's safety and refused to let David have her. She said the only way he could see her was to come by her home for visitation. It would be 2 weeks before she would hear from David again. He called and told her that he missed his daughter and finally admitted that the relationship with Sharon was awful. Debbie, fearing for David's life, told him to leave immediately. Sadly, that was the last time she would ever speak to David again. On August 22, 2015, David and Sharon returned from a vacation in Spain. Before their vacation, David had learned that he was about to be laid off from his law firm, which caused even more turmoil in their relationship. David's daughter, now 19 years old, had found her father in the bathroom, bleeding from his chest and leg. She confronted Sharon, who said she didn't mean to hurt him. The couple then went out to a local pub that evening, where witnesses also saw the injuries to David's chest and head still bleeding, and said Sharon didn't act concerned at all. After leaving the pub, a police officer found the couple in the middle of the street arguing. His body cam would catch Sharon's shout, "I'm gonna effing kill ya. I swear, David, when I wake up tomorrow, I don't know what mood I'm going to be in." For hours later, David's daughter sadly found him in bed, stabbed to death, and immediately called the police. After discovering the long history of domestic abuse, Sharon was arrested and charged with his murder. She then tried to claim that he had walked into the knife she was holding, but the police weren't buying her story. During the autopsy, David was found with 60 exterior wounds, including cuts on his thigh, knee, finger, and head. In the end, Sharon was found guilty of a first-degree murder and received a life sentence with a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison. In 2018, 16-year-old Ayanna Sawyer lived in Florida and was a student at Terry Parker High School. Unfortunately, for the past year, she had been in a sexual relationship with her uncle, Jonathan Quiles. While their relationship was very inappropriate, it's of note that the two were not blood-related. However, Ayanna ended up pregnant in early 2018. Once she became pregnant, Jonathan began to fear that his family would find out. Plus, Jonathan's wife, Ayanna's aunt, was also pregnant. Not wanting anyone to find out, he came up with a plan to get rid of Ayanna. So, on December 19, 2018, he lured Ayanna to the Ace Pick-a-Part where he worked, and he told her they were going to run away together. However, he had no intentions of running away. While Ayanna was sitting in a car in the back of the property, Jonathan attempted to strangle her, but it didn't work, so he pulled out a gun and shot her to death. He then used a carpet to conceal the body and put it in a dumpster. Later that day, the contents of the dumpster were emptied at the Otis Road landfill. Once investigators discovered where Ayanna's body was, they began sifting through more than 5,000 tons of trash. Sadly, after 16 days, her body was never recovered, but they did find some of her personal belongings. The murder was only discovered after some of his actions that day were caught on surveillance camera. The footage shows him leaving around 11 a.m. in the red minivan she was murdered in. He can then be seen returning an hour and a half later. Weeks after she was reported missing, Jonathan's brother, Joseph Quiles, alerted law enforcement that Jonathan confessed to killing and dumping Ayanna's body. After being arrested, He confessed once again to 2 jail inmates, and one of those conversations was even captured on an audio recording. Sadly, during the trial, it was revealed that Jonathan had even sexually assaulted Ayanna's sister. His now ex-wife, Naomi Mobley, remembers the day Ayanna was murdered. She remembered that particular day because she was pregnant and up and down all night but noticed Jonathan sleeping like a baby. She was also shocked when she found out about their relationship and originally didn't believe it. In the end, Jonathan was found guilty of first-degree murder of Ayanna and her unborn child and sexual assault. On October 3, 2023, Jonathan was sentenced to life in prison. Sing Pong, who went by Jim, was a rich Taiwanese businessman who founded Ranger Electronic Communications, which marketed CB radios to police forces worldwide. His fortune was estimated to be worth $200 million in the 90s. He lived with his wife, Li Young Pong, who went by Lisa, and their 2 teenage children in Rancho Santa Margarita, Orange County, California. After marrying, Lisa quit her career to help out her husband. In 1992, 49-year-old Jim met 24-year-old Ran Bangji, who went by Jennifer during a work trip to China. Jennifer was working as a manager in the public relations department at a hotel Jim was staying at. The affair with Jennifer quickly took off and Jim took her back to the United States with him. He then found her an apartment in Mission Viejo, California, just a short distance from the home he shared with Lisa. Jim then began providing her $5,000 a month to fund a new business that would be associated with his. He then had her work from his office so that he could spend more time with her. It wasn't long before Lisa began suspecting Jim of having an affair, especially after she discovered women's clothing in their home that didn't belong to her. However, when she approached him about the matter, he didn't try and hide it and confirmed they belonged to Jennifer. Lisa then went to Jim's office and confronted Jennifer, but she refused to stop the affair. Lisa continued to find Jennifer's clothes at the house and demanded that Jim fire her, but he refused. He basically made it clear to Lisa that he would continue the relationship with Jennifer, but was firmly against divorce. He made Jennifer aware of the same. Eventually, Jennifer became pregnant, which Jim was very unhappy about. Regardless, he continued maintaining his double life, and in early 1993, she gave birth to their son, Kevin G. 5 months later, things would take a horrible turn for the worse. On August 18, 1993, Jim went to visit Jennifer and his son, but strangely found her apartment door open. Upon entering, he found both Jennifer and Kevin deceased. Jennifer had been stabbed, while Kevin was suffocated to death. Immediately became a suspect, especially after learning about his double life. However, he had a strong alibi since he was in China on a business trip when the murders occurred. As a result, detectives focused their attention on the other person with a motive for murder, Jim's wife, Lisa. A bite mark was found on Jennifer's body and it still had saliva in it. From that, they were able to collect DNA and send it off for comparison. When the results came back, it was a perfect match to Lisa's DNA. Even after the DNA results, Lisa continued to maintain her innocence. Jim then requested a moment alone with Lisa before the officers took her into custody. They began speaking in Mandarin, believing they would not be understood. However, the recorded audio was translated and Jim can be heard asking Lisa why she did it. Lisa then incriminates herself by telling Jim that Jennifer had slipped on the knife in self-defense. Jim testified at a preliminary hearing and then left the country and never returned. 2 trials later, Lisa was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. If you've never heard of this case, that's likely because her trial was going on at the same time as the O.J. Simpson trial. In a shocking turn of events, California's 4th District Court of Appeals overturned the verdict in October of 1999 because police failed to inform Lisa of her constitutional rights and ignored her numerous pleas for an attorney. During her 3rd trial, the jury deadlocked, prompting the prosecution to offer her a plea bargain. If she agreed to 2 charges of voluntary manslaughter, she would be given 11 years in prison and upon release, would be deported from the United States and never allowed to return. She accepted and was deported back to Taiwan after serving her term. As of 2023, Lisa would be in her 70s. but since being deported, there's been no further updates on her. The parents of Jennifer sued Jim for $2 million, claiming he should have known Lisa intended to kill their daughter, yet never took any precautions to prevent it. However, the outcome of the lawsuit remains unknown. Lily Sullivan was born the only child to Anna Sullivan in 2003. Anna described her daughter as a beautiful, kind, and loving individual. By the age of 18, Lily was a college student living in Wales, United Kingdom, and had just started taking driving lessons. On the night of December 16, 2021, Lily went with friends to the Out nightclub a couple of hours away in Pembroke. It's there that an intoxicated Lily met 31-year-old Lewis Haynes. Haynes' friend reminded him that he had a girlfriend and that Lily was far too young for him, but he didn't care. Eventually, the two ended up kissing inside the club before walking outside separately around 2 a.m. However, once outside, they once again started talking and then made their way to a nearby alleyway. It's there that a surveillance camera caught them making out once again. Haynes then tried to initiate sex, but Lily turned him down, making him very angry. Afterward, at 2:47 a.m., she called her mother to confirm she was still picking her up. They had already planned to meet at the Green Garage, but during their conversation, the call suddenly dropped. Anna then began trying to call Lily back, but after trying 30 times, she never answered and all the calls went to voicemail. At 3 a.m., a person living in the area heard someone screaming. Sadly, would never talk to her daughter again. Eventually, Lily's topless body was found in the nearby freshwater reservoir called Mill Pond. Anna had unknowingly seen her daughter's killer walk past her car at 3:09 a.m. as she sat and waited for Lily to show up. Anna noticed that the man was shaking his head and holding his head in his hands. She found his behavior so strange that she decided to follow him. However, she lost sight of him when he entered some nearby woods. Turns out, after Lily rejected Haynes, he got so angry that he strangled her to death and dumped her body in the reservoir. Haynes was going through family court trying to regain visitation with his child, and for some reason, he thought if anyone knew he wanted to have sex with Lily, it would hurt his case, so he murdered her. Haynes then went home and told his girlfriend what he did. He also confessed to his parents, but told them he murdered Lily because she threatened to accuse him of sexual assault. According to Haynes, the threat came after she discovered he was in a relationship. When police showed up at his mother's home, he confessed to the murder. In the end, Haynes was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.